Welcome back. In this second part of the talk, I want to focus on what's called social epistemology. Because social epistemology is going to provide the background for understanding the issues of epistemic injustice and a way to connect Gadamer's views, Gadamer's epistemology, if you like, to the issues of epistemic injustice. Okay, let's give some background into social epistemology. Social epistemology is a fairly recent movement in epistemology, the study of knowledge. Probably the best way to understand social epistemology is in contrast to one of the classic epistemological thinkers, René Descartes. So here are some of the features of Descartes' epistemology, Descartes' theory of knowledge. For one thing, Descartes focuses on an individual knower. He's interested in an individual person making judgments, having clear and distinct ideas, and then making sure those clear and distinct ideas match up with what they've experienced and know about the world. He's interested in what we'll call an internal justification of his beliefs. That is the method of doubt, where you think about why you believe what you do, where you reflect on the reasons for it, and in this internal process, you come to arrive at a certain amount of certainty about your beliefs and about the world. He's also focused on providing a context-independent account of justification. That is, his account of aiming at certainty is meant to transcend any cultural historical conditions to arrive at a kind of universal truth that is not simply an expression of what someone might think in France in the early 17th century, but something that captures something absolutely universal about what it means to be a human being. So those are features of Cartesian epistemology: the focus on the individual, an individual mind grasping the world, the focus on individual internal processes by which we come to acquire knowledge, and the focus on the idea that what we really want to understand is knowledge that transcends, that is independent of the context in which we are acquiring this knowledge. In contrast, social epistemologists, contemporary social epistemology will focus not on the individual knower, but ask questions about the possibility of a collective knower. What does it mean, for example, that a jury decides someone is guilty or innocent? The jury existing as a collective, as being larger than the individual, or that Congress decides something, or that a group of people hold a belief separate from each individual person holding the belief. So social epistemologists start to want to ask this kind of question about collective knowers, not just about individual knowers. They also want to focus on the kinds of social processes that go into justification. So they focus not so much on just the individual justifier, but the ways in which our social interactions lead us to acquire knowledge. And the one we've seen the most of so far is the way in which testimony operates in the production of knowledge. It turns out that much of our knowledge that we have simply comes from the words of others, taking the word of others to be the case. And so it makes sense to think about these social interactions and the way these social interactions function in helping us acquire knowledge. Finally, where Descartes focused on context independence, social epistemologists will move away from that and talk about the ways in which there's a cultural and historical dependence on the kinds of things we know and don't know. This is not necessarily historical relativism. What it is saying is the very fact we know so much about, say, male pattern baldness says something about our society and the priorities of societies and the kinds of people who are researchers and the kinds of people who are doctors. And the fact we know much more about that than we know about certain parts of female reproduction anatomy says something about the context dependence of our knowledge. Where this idea of context dependence really took off is with Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he argued that the scientific discoveries that we have are based in certain paradigmatic ways of thinking about the world. And these paradigms unfold over time, discoveries come to be over time, until there becomes a conflict that the paradigm itself can't resolve. And as a result of that, there's new paradigms that arise, there's kind of a crisis. And once a new paradigm establishes itself as able to resolve the previous paradigm's problems, then we have new research plans along the lines of the new paradigm, and the context is what helps establish and explain why certain theories are accepted and other theories are not accepted. Okay, so that gives you an idea of sort of the main movements in social epistemology. I want to stress that social epistemology is not rejecting traditional epistemology. There still are individual knowers. There still are individual mental processes that produce knowledge. They're saying we also should focus on the possibility of collective knowers, of groups that can know and have beliefs and be epistemic agents. Also, we should focus on the way our social interactions produce knowledge, independent from the internal processes that might be going on inside somebody's head. And also we should look at the social context to understand the ways in which tradition and history have shaped the questions we're asking and the answers that we're likely to give, and has led us toward having certain kinds of knowledge and not other kinds of knowledge. Okay, now that I've laid out some of the main ideas of social epistemology, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the first time Miranda Fricker brings up issues of epistemic injustice is in the context of a talk about social epistemology. Now, it's clear the way that testimonial injustice factors into the story, because it focuses social epistemology focuses so much on the ways in which interaction is necessary for a significant amount of our knowledge acquisition. But there's another way in which this is the case. Think about the ways in which there are social practices that themselves might be structured in a way to lead to epistemic injustices. For example, just think about the process of becoming a philosophy professor. Right? On the one hand, there are prejudicial biases that professors have towards certain kinds of students and not other kinds of students. Historically, women have been discouraged from pursuing careers in philosophy explicitly, but also women are implicitly discouraged from pursuing careers in philosophy, and it may just be a matter of the psychology of a professor, a male professor, who recognizes a younger version of himself in a young undergraduate and gives that version of himself more attention than he would to a young female undergraduate with whom he does not identify in the same sort of way. So there are prejudices built in, explicit and implicit prejudices built in, that discourage women from entering the field of philosophy, which is still largely dominated by men. And as a result of those sorts of prejudices that are built into, that are part of the system of developing philosophy professors, so too the kinds of areas of interest that women might be more likely to be interested in than men don't get developed with the same sort of breadth and depth that the areas than the rest of philosophy is. I mean, I had the experience of grad school in a course on Hobbes, where I wanted to write a research paper on feminist criticisms of Hobbes. And I was told by the professor, I brought the proposal to him, and this is a quote, he said, "If it's feminist, it's not philosophical, and it's philosophical, it's not feminist." So it was made explicitly clear at that time that any interest in feminist philosophy was purely a political interest, and he said explicitly that I was not allowed to turn his classroom into a forum for my political views. It's purely a political interest, not a philosophical interest. And we can see how that explicitly ruled out research on my part into that topic, but in general discourages women and the kind of interests that women might be drawn toward from being pursued in the discipline of philosophy. A second example, different from this one, is the idea that there may be norms within a practice which are more comfortable being fulfilled by men than women. In philosophy, the classic example is a kind of aggressive argumentation in certain kinds of classes where, especially in analytic philosophy classes, it seems that part of the game is proving the person wrong in a distinctively humiliating way. This sort of practice rewards a certain kind of undergraduate personality and graduate personality, right, and discourages others who maybe don't want to participate in that kind of game from continuing in philosophy or seeing themselves as having a successful career in philosophy. So there are norms within the practice that may lead to the exclusion of some kinds of people as opposed to others, and then lead to certain forms of the practice being carried on and others not. So that's a second kind of way in which the social structures can bring about an epistemic injustice. A third way is that there could be norms in the practice, there could be practices that by themselves are not unjust, but the way Sandy Goldberg puts it, the way they're policed leads to a kind of epistemic injustice. So take, for example, a class, a graduate course in which discussion and question and answer with the professor is a central part of the classroom activities. And you have one student who went to a very elite school and got a very advanced education in philosophy, and another student who maybe worked their way through community colleges and other programs, but was bright enough and successful enough to make it to grad school, but doesn't have the same sort of background, intellectual background that the other students have. Although the policy of having classroom discussions is by itself not a source of epistemic injustice, the way it functions in the class may be to reinforce divisions that themselves are connected to race, class, gender, in the ways in which different students are prepared for the discussions or not prepared for the discussions, and as a result may be self-censoring or not feeling comfortable participating in the classroom discussions. Okay, so let me back up again to be clear about this, that not only are there clear cases of testimonial injustice because social epistemology focuses on the ways that interpersonal interaction is important, necessary for the production of knowledge, but there are social practices that have built into them prejudices that may lead to certain groups becoming marginalized. And in the case of philosophy, we'll distinguish the practices. There are prejudices on the part of the members of the group that exclude people, or that when those people are part of the group that is producing knowledge, they perhaps play a secondary role or discriminated against in the roles. Second, there may be norms in the practice that reward certain kinds of personalities and certain people over others. And third, there may be ways in which practices are policed, the ways in which the practices actually function. By themselves, they aren't unjust, but the way that they function actually works to reproduce injustices. Up to now, I really said nothing about hermeneutics as a philosophical tradition. So at this point, I'd like to turn to that. Hermeneutic, generally when we talk about hermeneutic injustice, what we're focused on is hermeneutic as the idea of interpretation. That's the core meaning of hermeneutics, interpretation. And a hermeneutic injustice is a kind of injustice that affects one's ability to interpret their situation or their experiences. There's also the word hermeneutics, which is the study of interpretation. Generally, when we talk about hermeneutics as a study of interpretation, the historical focus of that study has been on biblical or scriptural interpretation, because there tends to be much more at stake in making sure that religious interpretations are accurate, at least historically. It was a life and death matter. So you wanted to make sure that your hermeneutic approaches to the scriptural texts were on spot. But then there is, in addition, a philosophical tradition. We'll call it philosophical hermeneutics. And philosophical hermeneutics draws upon this core idea that thinking about interpretation provides us insights into the key questions of philosophy. So interpretation is not just one study among other areas of philosophy. It turns out to be a core area of philosophical thought, one that sheds light on many other areas of philosophy. So with that in mind, philosophical hermeneutics, especially as is articulated in the work of Hans-Georg Gadamer, sees itself as continuing or in the wake of the tradition of biblical hermeneutics, but expanding the ideas of biblical hermeneutics more generally, first to all texts, and then to all the humanities, and then in general to what it means to be a human being.
Warum nennen wir das aber jetzt Hermeneutik? Ich glaube deswegen, weil wir erstmals sehen, dass das in anderen Disziplinen schon vorhandene Hilfsmittel einer Lehre von der Auslegung von Texten eine viel weitere Bedeutung hat, als nur sich auf Texte zu beschränken. Oder sagen wir besser, dass es sich um den Text der Welt handelt oder vielleicht gar um den Text der Weltgeschichte, den wir auf unsere Weise auszulegen und damit mit uns selbst uns zu verständigen, die Aufgabe haben.
So I'm going to look briefly at what Gadamer has to contribute. What are his unique, distinctive contributions to issues of interpretation and textual interpretation? And by looking at those, we'll be able to see how they connect up to issues in social epistemology. And we're going to work toward this core idea that Gadamer's hermeneutics connects nicely with themes in social epistemology. You can think about core issues in Gadamer and Gadamer's hermeneutics as being issues of social epistemology. That will then provide a way for us to connect together the insights of Gadamer's philosophical hermeneutics with the concerns of epistemic injustice through social epistemology. So what does Gadamer specifically contribute to theories of interpretation? I would argue there's two things. The first thing is the idea that a correct interpretation requires two criteria, has to meet two criteria. The first criteria is it must connect the parts of the text together. Now, this is not so new. It's a classic idea in hermeneutics that the interpretation of the parts have to fit together in the whole and are informed by the whole, and the whole text in terms is understood through the interpretation of the parts. There is a dialectical relationship between the parts and the whole, where we understand the parts of a text in light of the whole and understand the whole in light of the parts. But this is at least one mark of a good interpretation, is that the parts of the text fit together in a whole. Now, what counts as the whole is complicated. When you're reading Aristotle's Ethics, for example, Nicomachean Ethics, is Book 10 part of the original, or is it something added on the end? It might be part of the very interpretation that we say a certain stretch of the text is to be rendered coherent and another part does not belong to it. Or, for example, when we were trying to render something coherent, are we connected together with other texts by the same author, other texts by the same period? It was often thought by Neoplatonic philosophers in the early Middle Ages that Plato and Aristotle had to be understood as saying the same thing. So fitting the parts of the text together in a whole meant fitting Plato and Aristotle together, even where it seems like Aristotle is criticizing Plato. So this is an elaborate enterprise, and it's not always clear what counts as the whole, but it is clear that a successful interpretation shows the way the parts fit together in a whole. Secondly, the second mark of a successful interpretation is that the text reveals an insight about the subject matter of the text. As we learn something from it, there is a truth in the phenomenological sense of something is disclosed to us through the text. So if the text doesn't reveal something, we have two interpretations. Both of them show the coherence of the text. One shows how it is insightful, and one doesn't. The one that shows how the text is insightful for us is the preferable interpretation, according to Gadamer. Okay, so it helps for understand Gadamer's unique contributions to see how these play out. So first of all, it's important for Gadamer that the coherence of the text is achieved by reading the text as an answer to a question or a set of related questions. Right? This is the source of the unity of text. Gadamer will see all successful interpretations as seeing the text as an answer to a question. So we're always trying to find the question to which the text is an answer. Now, it could be any question, right? It could be a question that we find that is very historically conditioned and the sort of thing that only someone in the early Middle Ages, say, would care much about. So the second criteria then establishes what kind of questions are the ones that are also valuable for us. That is, when the text reveals truths to us, it is because we've learned something either from the question, as we've learned how to ask a question that it didn't occur to us to ask before, that is an important question to ask, or we've learned something about the answer to the question. Maybe it is a question that we've thought about, but we haven't thought about this kind of answer. That's two ways in which insights can arise from this logic of question and answer. That is one of Gadamer's most distinctive contributions to hermeneutics, is this idea of the logic and question and answer. So for the question to be a live question, a relevant question for us, it has to either see the historical question as still relevant today, or it has to see the text as addressing a question that's relevant today in, say, a new way, a way we never thought of because we're in a very different historical period, cultural period, than when the text is written. Okay, moreover, for the parts of it all to fit together, there are certain assumptions we have to bring to the table. They're working assumptions that without which we cannot arrive at a convincing interpretation. The first is there has to be a presumption of coherence. Obviously, if we're trying to show how the parts fit together, we have to presume from the start an anticipation, he calls it, of the coherence of the text. Second, there has to be a presumption of the rationality of the text. After all, the text isn't seen as a legitimate answer to a question, so it must be intelligible, it must be rational, it must be the kinds of things an intelligent, rational person would say in that time when presented with this question. And third, there has to be a presumption of truth. One of the goals of a successful interpretation is that it teaches us something. It generates insights. So we have to approach the text with the anticipation that the text is going to teach us something we didn't know otherwise. So these are three things we have to enter into any interpretation with: a presumption of coherence, a presumption of rationality, and a presumption of insight or truth. Okay, and then of course Gadamer makes a clear point that there's no strict method. There's no method we can revert to that will always provide us with the best interpretation of a text. It is a kind of art. So that is what Gadamer says about interpretation, and that's what Gadamer's sort of distinctive contribution to theories of interpretation, this idea of the logic of question and answer and the various presuppositions that go into that. What's going on, though? We can ask, Gadamer also focuses on what's happening in the context of a good interpretation, what must be the case, what is happening for the interpretation to unfold, above and beyond anything that we're actually explicitly, consciously doing to bring about the interpretation. The first thing is that any engagement with a text, an attempt to understand it, is also an engagement with a tradition. And that in two ways. We only have a text if it has been handed down through tradition. That is one of the core meanings of tradition in the original Latin, means to be handed over. And in the German, Überlieferung means to be sort of passed on and passed over, handed over to us. We only have the Nicomachean Ethics from Aristotle, for example, because for thousands of years it was written down by hand, copied by hand, passed on, valued, recovered, preserved in libraries, redone in more and more definitive editions, hopefully getting close to what it might actually have looked like in Aristotle's time. Right? So they're only because there is a tradition of taking this text seriously, of trying to preserve the writing of the text, that the text exists at all. So to be participating in the reading of the text is already participating and connected to a tradition that values these very ideas as worth reading and think about. Right? So that's one way in which we're connected to tradition when we're reading a text, whether we like it or not, above and beyond anything we're trying to do. There's a second sense in which interpretation belongs to a tradition. And that is not just that we belong to the tradition of text being handed over, but we are interpreting within the context of a tradition. So perhaps we are reading this in the context of, say, contemporary Christian thought. Okay, tradition of Marxist interpretations, traditions of feminist interpretations. For these, Gadamer uses the Latin word tradition, not the German word Überlieferung. So we're embedded in traditions in two senses, and we can be embedded in multiple traditions in that way. You can both have a Marxist reading of Aristotle and a feminist reading of Aristotle and a neo-Stoic reading of Aristotle. Right? Each one has different traditions of reading. And by participating through that reading, looking to see the ways in which the text is intelligible in that context of a tradition, we are contributing to that tradition of interpretation and standing in line of a tradition of interpretation. So that is the second meaning in which Gadamer talks about the way tradition functions. What Gadamer says about understanding a text, he says about understanding in general. That is, understanding only happens against a background of prejudices, prejudgments, which render certain sorts of views intelligible and other views nonsensical from the start. And so by properly understanding what it is we know and what it is we understand, we need to think seriously about the ways in which the context makes certain kinds of knowledge and understanding possible and interferes with other kinds of knowledge and understanding. This is, of course, a central area of social epistemology, and it's reflected in Gadamer's views about the nature of understanding. The second thing is that Gadamer focuses on dialogue. Dialogue as a core phenomenon by which we acquire understanding. Not only do we engage in dialogue with texts, he thinks this is best understood as dialogue, he thinks in some sense all understanding is going to be dialogical. In the third lecture, I'll talk about his views that language at its heart is dialogical. But right now, I simply want to make this point. In the Center of Truth and Method, Gadamer talks about different ways of treating another person as a thou in exchange with them, in dialogue with them. And we can take the three criteria for understanding a text. Is it coherent? Is it rational? And is it true? He thinks all those have to be met for a proper understanding of a text. And we can map those onto his three ideas of how to treat another as a thou. If we treat them as merely providing an expression of their time, of their culture, as merely cohering with the kinds of views that belong to the period, we are treating them only at a surface level of a thou. We have not yet credited them with being rational or credited them being true. If we treat them at the second level, this is the second example of treating someone as a thou, we treat them as putting forward reasons and arguments, though reasons and arguments that are set up to be rejected, right? In this case, we're seeing them as both coherent and rational. But still, he says we are not fully treating them in the way we should in dialogue with the thou. He says we've only properly treated another person as a thou when we understand how it is what they're saying could be true. And this fits with what he says about interpreting a text and the conditions for interpreting a text. It now applies more broadly to understanding and interacting with another person. We can see this then as a kind of model for interaction, in social epistemology, about the ways we should respond to others, the way we should accept testimony from others, the way we should provide and interact with them in order to fulfill our epistemic responsibilities toward them. So there are two really clear ways in which Gadamer's hermeneutics, starting with textual interpretation, moving to interpretation in general and understanding in general, converges with two main themes in social epistemology: a focus on the background conditions for knowledge and a focus on the social interactions which allow knowledge to occur or interfere with the production of knowledge. There's a third thing I want to focus on, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time focusing on this. It doesn't belong to social epistemology, but it does belong to Gadamer's general approach to epistemological questions. And that is, as I've been emphasizing, he focuses on understanding more than knowledge. Where generally in epistemology you think of knowledge as being the main epistemic category, knowledge and truth, Gadamer instead, he'll certainly talk about knowledge quite a bit, but his main epistemic category is understanding. But before we get to that, this really is a perfect time to take a break. We shouldn't be looking at screens all day. Get up, move around, get yourself a cup of tea or something, and we'll come back in 5 minutes to talk about understanding.